The Hells Angels biker heard the little girl whisper, "Please save us," and his next move shattered the night. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The night was cold, the kind of bitter chill that seeps into your bones. A thick fog hung over the quiet street, and the only sound was the low hum of the wind, carrying whispers through the darkness. But then, the whisper that pierced through the quiet came not from the wind, but from the faint, desperate voice of a little girl. "Please save us," she whispered, trembling with fear. For a moment, the world around him seemed to freeze. The biker, known to everyone around as Reaper, had ridden through many storms, seen many battles, and had heard his share of cries. But this was different. This was not a cry for help from a grown man, a fellow biker, or a victim of some crime. This was a child, vulnerable and alone. He had lived his whole life by a code that said you didn't get involved with the weak, with those who couldn't defend themselves. He was Hell's Angels, after all, a man who had earned his reputation through blood and steel. But as the words echoed in his mind, something inside him shifted. He had to help. He had no choice. He pulled the throttle of his bike, the roar of the engine breaking the eerie silence of the street. His heart raced faster than the bike could go, the sound of the engine almost drowning out his thoughts. As he approached the alley, his eyes searched the shadows, looking for the source of the voice. And then he saw her, a small figure, barely visible, clutching something against her chest, trembling in the cold. Her face was hidden in the hood of her jacket, but he could see the fear in her body language. She was scared, and she needed help. Reaper's mind raced. Was this a trap? A setup by someone who knew exactly how to lure him in? He had to be careful, but he couldn't ignore the call. He couldn't leave her there. As he pulled his bike to a stop, he dismounted and approached her slowly, keeping his distance at first. The little girl didn't move, but he could hear her soft sobs, barely audible under the weight of the night. "Hey there," he said gently, trying to soften his gruff voice. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him then, her big eyes filled with tears, but there was something else there too. A sense of trust. She must have seen something in his eyes, some flicker of humanity that made her believe he could help. She nodded weakly, her lips trembling as she spoke. "They're after me. Please help me." Reaper knelt down, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about protecting a child from danger. This was about doing something he had never done before. Letting someone in, showing compassion when his entire life had taught him to shut it out. "You're safe now," he said, his voice softer than he thought possible. "I'll get you somewhere safe." As he reached out to lift her into his arms, the fog seemed to grow thicker, and the darkness felt even more suffocating. But there was something about this moment, something that told him it wasn't too late to change, to do something good. The little girl clung to him, and for the first time in a long while, Reaper didn't feel the need to be strong. He felt something else, something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The road ahead was uncertain, and the danger still loomed. But at that moment, with the girl in his arms, Reaper knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her down. He wasn't going to walk away. The night had just begun, and his next move would change everything. The sound of the bike's engine faded as Reaper rolled up to his rundown garage on the outskirts of town, the little girl still clutched tightly in his arms. The night felt heavy, thick with uncertainty and fear, yet something in the pit of his stomach told him he was doing the right thing. He had been a biker for most of his life, a Hell's Angel, but this moment, this girl, had shaken something deep inside him. He parked the motorcycle and helped her off, gently placing her down on the cold concrete floor of the garage. She shivered, but not just from the cold. She was scared. Her wide eyes darted around the dimly lit room, taking in the worn leather jackets and motorcycle parts that littered the space. Reaper could feel her unease, but he couldn't blame her. This place, with its dim lights and the scent of oil and metal, must have seemed like a strange, intimidating world to a young child. "It's okay, kid," he said softly, trying to put her at ease. "You're safe here." He moved around, grabbing an old blanket from the corner of the room and wrapping it around her shoulders, hoping the warmth would help. He didn't know her name yet, but he intended to keep it that way. There was no need for introductions when she needed protection, and that's exactly what he was going to give her. The little girl looked up at him, her face still wet with tears. Her clothes were dirty, torn in places, and the bruises on her arms were visible even under the dim light. But it was her eyes that hit him the hardest. There was fear, yes, but also something else, something that Reaper hadn't seen in a long time. Trust. What's your name? He asked gently, as he sat down across from her. Mia, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mia, huh? Reaper nodded, trying to keep the conversation light, though he felt a heavy weight on his chest. How old are you, Mia? I'm 8, she said, her voice a little steadier now. 8. Reaper's heart sank. She was so young, too young to be caught up in whatever mess had landed her here. What happened to you, Mia? He asked, leaning forward slightly. Mia hesitated, her eyes flickering away from his as she tugged the blanket tighter around herself. My mom told me to run. She said they were coming for us. Who? Reaper's tone was firm but soft, his hands clenched into fists. I don't know. They were bad men. They hurt her. Mia's voice cracked as she spoke, and Reaper felt a surge of anger rise within him. It wasn't the first time he had heard stories like this, but hearing it from a child, seeing it in her eyes, made the anger burn hotter than ever. Mia, he said, his voice low and steady. You don't have to worry about them anymore. I'll protect you. She nodded, her eyes still full of uncertainty. Reaper stood up, pacing the small garage as he thought about the situation. He knew he couldn't keep her here forever. He wasn't equipped to care for a child. He had no idea how to give her the kind of life she deserved. But he wasn't about to turn her away. He had made a promise to himself years ago that he would protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And that promise, buried deep beneath the layers of anger and bitterness, still meant something to him. Mia sat quietly, her little hands clutching the edges of the blanket as she watched him. She was so small, so fragile, and yet she was here, fighting to survive. Reaper couldn't let her down. Not now. Not when she needed him most. He turned back to her, meeting her eyes once again. We're gonna get you somewhere safe, Mia. I'll make sure of it. The words felt strange coming from his mouth, but they were true. He would do whatever it took. He had no idea what the next few days would bring. He didn't even know how he was going to handle the mess he was now in. But for Mia, he would figure it out. She needed him. And for the first time in a long while, Reaper realized that maybe he needed someone too. The silence in the garage stretched between them, heavy with uncertainty and the weight of what was to come. But for now, at least, they were safe. And that was enough. Reaper turned back to his bike and started checking his gear, his mind racing with plans. But as he did, a nagging thought kept creeping into his head. Whoever had hurt Mia, whoever had been chasing her, wasn't going to stop. They would come for her again. And when they did, Reaper would be ready. He would make sure they never hurt her again. The sound of the bike's engine filled the air, and for a moment, the weight of the night seemed to lift just a little. Reaper had a job to do, and he was going to make sure it got done, no matter what. Reaper sat in the dimly lit garage, his hands resting on the handlebars of his bike, eyes staring out into the dark night. Mia, still wrapped in the blanket, sat on the old couch, clutching the fabric tightly around her small body. She was trying to stay warm, but the shock from everything that had happened was still written all over her face. Reaper could see it in the way she flinched at every sound, the way her eyes darted around the room, as if she was expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. He didn't blame her. The night had already been long and filled with enough terror to last a lifetime. The storm outside continued to rage, the sound of the wind howling against the garage, shaking the walls. Reaper rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the tension that had built up over the past hour. He couldn't just sit here. He had to do something. He needed to get Mia somewhere safe, but he wasn't sure where. He was alone in this place. There was no backup, no team of riders ready to rush in and handle things. It was just him, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. He turned to Mia, who was staring at him with those big, innocent eyes. You okay? He asked, his voice rough from the hours of tension and silence. Mia nodded, though it was clear she was still trembling. I'm scared, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Reaper's heart twisted in his chest at the sound of her words. He had seen fear in the eyes of grown men, men who had fought wars, who had done things they could never take back. But this was different. This was a child, a girl who should have been playing with toys and going to school, not hiding in a garage from men who wanted to hurt her. He had made a promise to her mother, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was because he had seen something in the way Mia's mother had looked at him when she had begged him to protect her daughter. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, he wanted to do something good. "You're safe here," Reaper said, walking over and sitting down beside her. He knew the words were empty, but he had to say them. He had to believe them. Mia looked at him, her eyes wide, as if trying to gauge whether or not she could trust him. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear that lingered from everything she had been through. And in that moment, Reaper understood that it wasn't just the people after her that she was running from. It was the world itself. "I'll protect you," he said, his voice firm, though it cracked just a little. Mia sniffled, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket. "Thank you," she said softly, and the sincerity in her voice made Reaper's chest tighten even more. He didn't know how he was going to keep her safe. He didn't even know if he could, but he was going to try. The silence between them stretched for a moment, before Mia spoke again. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of curiosity. Reaper let out a sigh and rubbed his hands together, trying to figure out his next move. "Now, we wait," he said finally. "I need to figure out who's after you, and why. But for now, you're staying here. No one's going to get you." Mia seemed to relax at his words, though the worry still lingered in her eyes. She was too young for this, too innocent to be caught in the middle of a war she didn't understand. Reaper stood up, his mind racing as he walked over to a desk cluttered with old papers and tools. He grabbed his phone, checking it once again, hoping for some kind of answer, some lead that would help him track down the people who had put Mia in danger. But there was nothing. The phone remained silent. "I'll get us out of this," Reaper muttered to himself, more for his own benefit than for Mia's. He turned back to her, meeting her eyes for the first time since they had entered the garage. "You're not alone in this, Mia. I promise." She smiled weakly, the first smile he had seen from her since this nightmare had started. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. Reaper walked over to the door, peering out into the storm. The wind was picking up, the rain now falling in sheets. It wasn't just a storm outside, it was a storm inside, one that Reaper had been running from for years. He had built walls around himself, kept everyone at a distance, thinking it was the only way to survive. But now, with Mia, those walls seemed to be crumbling. He had something to fight for, and he wasn't going to stop until she was safe. The door creaked open, and he stepped outside, his boots crunching against the wet gravel. He stood there for a moment, looking out into the darkness, the storm swirling around him, and he made a silent vow to himself. He would protect Mia, no matter the cost, and anyone who tried to hurt her would answer to him. Reaper stood outside in the storm, the harsh wind whipping against his jacket, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The rain had turned into a steady downpour, the kind that made everything feel colder, heavier. He glanced back at the garage, where Mia was still inside, wrapped in the blanket he had given her, sitting quietly as she waited. He hated leaving her alone, but he had no choice. He needed to figure out who was after her and why. He couldn't protect her if he didn't know who the enemy was. The storm was getting worse, the thunder rumbling in the distance like a warning. Reaper's fingers tightened around the handle of his bike as he walked toward it, the familiar feeling of the handlebars grounding him in the chaos of the moment. He had been on the road for years, had seen things that would break most people. But this, protecting a child, was different. He had never expected his life to take a turn like this. He wasn't sure how to do it. He wasn't sure he could do it. He had never been a hero. He was just a biker, a man who lived by a code of loyalty and violence. But now, with Mia, the stakes were higher. He couldn't just ride away from this. Not now. Not when she needed him. The roar of his bike's engine echoed through the storm as he started it up, the vibrations running through his bones. He revved the throttle, the sound drowning out everything else, as if trying to block out the doubt and fear creeping into his mind. He knew he had to find answers. He had to track down the people who had hurt Mia's mother and were now after her. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed to figure out who he could trust. He thought of his brothers in the Hells Angels, the men he had ridden with for years. He had always believed in loyalty, in protecting those who had earned it. But could he bring them into this? Could he ask them to help protect a little girl who wasn't even a part of their world? Reaper wasn't sure. He wasn't sure about anything anymore. He rode through the streets, the rain pouring down, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He had been in enough dark places to know when something wasn't right. The feeling of being watched, the creeping sensation that someone was following him, gnawed at the back of his mind. He couldn't shake it. It was as if someone was waiting for the right moment to strike. Reaper's grip on the handlebars tightened as he turned a corner, the wheels of his bike sliding slightly on the slick road. The storm had made the streets dangerous, but he couldn't slow down. Not now. Not with Mia back at the garage, alone. He had to find out who was after her. The alley he turned into was narrow, the buildings on either side looming over him like silent sentinels. The storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling through the gaps in the walls. And that's when he saw them. Two men standing in the shadows, their faces hidden beneath hooded jackets, watching him intently. Reaper's instincts kicked in. He slowed his bike, keeping a tight grip on the throttle, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. He wasn't sure if they were the ones he was looking for, but he had learned long ago to trust his gut. Something about them didn't sit right. He stopped his bike a few feet away, the engine rumbling in the tense silence. The men didn't move, but he could feel their eyes on him, sizing him up, waiting for him to make the first move. "What do you want?" Reaper asked, his voice low and steady, but carrying a weight that made the men hesitate. One of them shifted, his hand moving toward his jacket, but Reaper was faster. He pulled his knife from his pocket, the blade flashing in the dim light. "You better answer fast," he growled. "I don't have time for games." The men exchanged a glance, the tension thick in the air. For a moment, everything was still. And then, without warning, one of the men stepped forward, his voice low but urgent. "We're not here for you," he said, his tone almost pleading. "We're looking for the girl." Reaper's heart skipped a beat, his grip on the knife tightening. The girl. They were after Mia. "Who are you?" Reaper asked, his voice hardening. "Why are you after her?" The man didn't answer right away. He glanced at his companion, his face a mask of uncertainty. "It's not what you think," he said finally. "She's in danger." But before he could finish, a third man stepped out of the shadows, his face twisted with anger. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," he sneered. "Now, you're gonna regret it." Reaper didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his knife flashing as he struck. The third man barely had time to react before Reaper had him pinned against the wall, the blade at his throat. "You're going to tell me everything," Reaper growled. "And if you don't, I'll make sure you never hurt anyone again." The man's eyes widened with fear, but before he could say anything more, a loud crash echoed through the alley. Reaper turned just in time to see a van screech around the corner, its headlights blinding in the storm. The door slid open, and more men poured out, their faces masked, their weapons drawn. Reaper's heart raced. This was no longer just about Mia. This was a full-blown fight. He had to act fast. He pulled the knife away from the man's throat and dove for his bike. "You stay here," he shouted to the man, his voice firm. "You're lucky I'm letting you go. But if you come near her again, I'll kill you." With that, he revved the engine and sped off into the storm, the sound of the van's pursuit growing louder behind him. He had to get back to the garage. Mia was still there, and she was the key to everything. Whoever these men were, they weren't going to stop until they had her. And Reaper wasn't going to let that happen. Not on his watch. Reaper's mind raced as he revved his bike, the engine roaring into the stormy night. The rain lashed against his face, but his focus was razor-sharp. His heart pounded in his chest as he tore through the streets, knowing that every second counted. He couldn't let Mia fall into the hands of those men. They were closing in, and the garage was still too exposed. He had to get her out of there, somewhere safe, before they found her. The alley where he had confronted the men was still fresh in his mind, the menacing figures and their cryptic warnings. But now, the pursuit was no longer just about the men who had followed him. He could feel the weight of a larger, darker force closing in on them both. As he sped down the wet, slippery streets, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The headlights of the van were still behind him, growing nearer with every passing second. The men weren't going to give up easily. Reaper's grip tightened around the handlebars as he took a sharp turn, sending the bike skidding slightly on the slick asphalt. His heart raced, and adrenaline surged through him as he pushed the bike harder. There was no time to waste. Mia was alone in that garage, vulnerable, and those men wouldn't hesitate to hurt her if they caught up. The thought made his stomach tighten, his anger flaring as he pushed the bike even faster. He had never been afraid of a fight, never hesitated when it came to protecting those he cared about. But Mia wasn't part of his world, not really. She was just a kid, caught in the crossfire of a life she didn't choose. Reaper wasn't sure how he had found himself here, taking on a responsibility he hadn't planned for. But now he was committed. The garage came into view, its faded, weathered walls standing against the storm like a lonely sentinel. Reaper slammed on the brakes as he pulled up, the tires screeching in protest. He jumped off the bike, his boots hitting the wet pavement with a thud as he rushed toward the door. His instincts told him to be cautious, but the fear that had been gnawing at him since he left Mia hit him full force. He yanked open the door and stepped inside. The garage was dark, the air heavy with the scent of motor oil and metal. Mia was still there, huddled on the couch, her small frame curled into herself under the blanket. Her wide eyes met his as he stepped inside, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift off his shoulders. She was safe. For now. Mia, he said, his voice low but firm. We need to go? Now. Mia didn't hesitate. She stood up immediately, her small feet stumbling slightly as she rushed over to him. He could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else there too. Trust. She trusted him, and for the first time in a long time, Reaper felt a glimmer of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He was going to keep her safe, no matter what it took. Stay close, he said as he grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the back door. He moved quickly, his mind working through the next steps. He couldn't stay here. The men in the van would be here soon, and they would bring more with them. Reaper had no intention of letting them catch him or Mia. As they made their way through the darkened garage, Reaper heard the faintest noise from outside. A door slamming. A shout. He froze, his senses sharpening. They were here. They had found him. He cursed under his breath and pulled Mia closer, his grip tight on her small hand. Come on, he said urgently. We have to move. They reached the back door, and Reaper peered through the cracked wood. He could see shadows moving in the alley, the faint outline of the van parked just a few feet away. The men were getting out. There was no time to waste. Reaper yanked open the door and pulled Mia out into the night. The rain poured down, the cold hitting them both like a wall. Reaper's boots splashed through the puddles as he ran, pulling Mia along behind him. He knew where he was going. He had a safe house on the outskirts of town, a place no one would think to look. But getting there would be a challenge. They had to stay ahead of the men, keep moving. He glanced back over his shoulder, seeing the silhouettes of the men emerging from the garage. They were closing in fast. Reaper's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed Mia to move faster, her small legs struggling to keep up. He could hear the men's voices, their footsteps growing louder. There was no more time for thinking. Reaper made a split-second decision and darted into the shadows, pulling Mia with him. They ducked behind a row of old storage containers, the darkness swallowing them whole. Reaper held his breath, listening. The men's voices were just around the corner, their footsteps growing louder. He knew they were searching, trying to find them. But Reaper wasn't going to let them. Not now. Not when Mia's life was on the line. As the men passed by, Reaper peeked around the corner, his eyes locked on their figures. They were too close. He had to act. Stay here, he whispered to Mia, his voice steady despite the rising tension. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but trusting him. Reaper took a deep breath, his hand gripping the knife at his side. He was going to make sure Mia was safe, no matter the cost. Reaper crouched behind the row of storage containers, his breathing shallow as he waited for the men to pass. The sound of their footsteps grew louder, but he didn't move. Every muscle in his body was tense, his hand gripping the knife at his side. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. Not when Mia's life was on the line. The men were searching, scanning the alley, and it felt like an eternity as Reaper held his breath. He could see their shadows flicker in the dim light, the rain pouring down, turning the world into a blur of movement and noise. Mia was behind him, hiding in the darkness, her small frame barely visible against the blackness of the night. He could hear her soft breathing, too, as she tried to stay as still as possible. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her it would be okay, but he couldn't. Not yet. Not until they were safe. The men paused for a moment, their voices low as they whispered to each other. Reaper's heart pounded in his chest. They were close. Too close. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The knowledge that one wrong move could bring everything crashing down. The footsteps began to move again, and Reaper's instincts kicked in. He slowly turned to Mia, motioning for her to stay quiet. She nodded, her wide eyes reflecting the fear and confusion she must have been feeling. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes, and then slowly began to edge away from the containers. He was going to make a break for it. They couldn't stay here. The men would find them eventually. It was only a matter of time. Reaper's mind raced as he moved carefully, his footsteps as quiet as possible, making sure not to make any noise that would give away their position. They had to get to the bike. It was their only chance. The garage was no longer safe. The pursuit was too close. As he moved, Reaper kept his eyes on the men, watching as they slowly advanced down the alley, oblivious to the fact that they were being watched. He could see them clearly now, their dark figures outlined against the dim light. They were focused on their search, unaware that they were walking straight into a trap. Reaper felt his heart rate increase as he made his move. He turned back to Mia and motioned for her to follow. She hesitated for a moment, her fear evident, but then she nodded and slowly began to move behind him. Reaper moved first, staying low to the ground, keeping his body pressed against the wet walls of the alley as he crept toward the bike. He could feel the tension in the air, the electricity that came with the danger of being so close to discovery. Every step felt like it could be their last, but he kept going, knowing they had no choice. They had to make it. They had to outrun these men. They had to survive. The bike was just ahead, and as Reaper reached it, he quickly started it up, the engine roaring to life, cutting through the heavy silence of the storm. The sound was deafening, and for a split second, Reaper thought they had been made. But the men were still too far down the alley, and the noise of the storm covered the sound of the bike's engine. He didn't waste another second. Reaper revved the throttle, sending the bike roaring down the alley, Mia clinging to him tightly, her small arms wrapped around his waist. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The road ahead was their only focus. They needed to get out of the city, away from the danger that was closing in around them. The rain lashed against them as they sped through the streets, the wind whipping past them, but Reaper didn't slow down. He couldn't. The men were still behind them, and he knew they wouldn't give up until they had Mia. His grip tightened on the handlebars, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He had to get them out of there. They were still too close to the city. Reaper's mind raced as he thought of a safe place to go. There was a hideout, a cabin he had used in the past, far away from the city. It wasn't much, but it was off the grid, and it was the only place he could think of that might keep them safe. He wasn't sure how far they had to go, but it was better than staying in the city where the danger was real, and the enemy was too close. As he made a sharp turn, Reaper glanced back for just a second. The headlights of the van were still behind them, getting closer, but he pushed the bike harder. The engine roared louder as he opened it up, pushing it to its limits. They couldn't stop now. Not until they were safe. The night was full of danger, but there was something else too. Hope. The thought of getting Mia to safety, of getting her out of this nightmare, kept him going. It was the only thing that mattered now. The storm continued to rage, the rain falling harder, but Reaper didn't let it stop him. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, that the men chasing them wouldn't give up easily. But for the first time in a long time, Reaper had something to fight for. And he wasn't going to let anything happen to Mia. Not on his watch. Reaper pushed the bike faster, the engine roaring against the storm, the wind biting into his face as they tore through the empty streets. Mia was pressed tightly against his back, her arms wrapped around his waist as she clung to him, her small body shivering from the cold. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, and the streets were slick with water. Reaper's heart pounded, not from the speed, but from the danger that was still on their trail. He could hear the van's engine in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. They were still coming for them. He knew they wouldn't stop until they had her. Reaper's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to lose them. He had to get them to safety, but where? His cabin was the only place he could think of, but it wasn't far enough. The men in the van wouldn't give up easily, and they would track him down if they wanted to. He needed a plan, something that would get them out of this. As he turned another corner, Reaper spotted a bridge in the distance. It was old, barely visible in the rain, but it might just be the perfect place to lose the van. He pushed the throttle even harder, the bike responding with a growl as they sped toward the bridge. The rain pounded against the road, blurring his vision, but he didn't care. This was their chance. The van was gaining on them, but Reaper could feel something shifting inside him. He was no longer just running for his own life. He was running for Mia. The bridge was closer now, and Reaper could see the fog rolling over the water beneath it. It was a narrow, winding path, and if he could make it onto the bridge before the van, they might be able to escape. The bike's engine roared as Reaper leaned into the curve, the tires skidding slightly on the wet road. He glanced over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of the van's headlights, now almost directly behind them. The men were close. Too close. Reaper's grip tightened on the handlebars, his muscles straining as he pushed the bike harder. The rain was coming down in sheets now, the road almost entirely washed out, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't. Mia's life was in his hands. He had promised to protect her, and he would do whatever it took to keep that promise. As they approached the bridge, Reaper made a split-second decision. He veered off the main road, taking the bike onto the shoulder, just as the van roared past. The sudden change of direction caught the men off guard, and for a moment, Reaper thought they might have lost them. But as they flew across the wet gravel, the van skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the slick surface. Reaper didn't look back. He focused on the bridge ahead, his eyes narrowing as he raced toward it. The van wasn't far behind, but the bridge was their only chance. Reaper gunned the engine, the roar of the bike filling his ears as they hit the first set of metal grates. The bike shook slightly, but Reaper held steady, his heart racing. They were almost there. They had to make it across. The van was still on their tail, its headlights cutting through the rain like a pair of hunting wolves. Reaper's grip tightened around the handlebars, his jaw set as he pushed the bike faster. The bridge creaked beneath them, the old metal groaning in protest against the weight of the bike. Reaper could feel the bike sliding slightly, but he didn't slow down. Not now. Not when they were this close. The headlights of the van were getting closer, but just as Reaper reached the far side of the bridge, he made another sharp turn, this time down a narrow dirt path leading into the trees. The van didn't make the turn in time, and as Reaper sped into the forest, he heard the screech of tires as the men in the van attempted to follow. He didn't know if they had lost them completely, but he wasn't about to stop. The forest was dense, the path barely wide enough for the bike, but Reaper kept pushing forward. Mia's arms were still wrapped tightly around him, but she wasn't crying anymore. She was silent, her face pressed against his back, her small hands clutching him tightly. Reaper's heart swelled with a strange sense of pride. He had kept his promise so far, but the night was far from over. They weren't safe yet. The forest seemed to swallow them whole, the darkness of the trees closing in around them. The sound of the van's engine was still in the distance, but it was fading, and for a moment, Reaper allowed himself to believe that they had escaped. The path ahead seemed endless, winding through the trees and up small hills, the rain still coming down hard. Reaper pushed the bike even faster, his eyes scanning the trail ahead. They had to get to the cabin. It was their only chance. As they rode through the dense forest, the sound of the van's engine slowly faded away. Reaper didn't dare look back, but he could feel the weight of the night lifting just a little. They were getting closer. He could almost see the cabin in his mind's eye, the small, weathered building that had once been his refuge. It wasn't much, but it was safe. And right now, that was all that mattered. The sound of the rain pounding against the ground and the low hum of the bike's engine were the only things Reaper could hear as they rode on. He wasn't sure what would happen when they reached the cabin, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Mia would be safe, and that was all that mattered. Reaper's heart was still racing as he made his way through the dense woods, the sound of his bike's engine cutting through the rain-soaked silence. Mia was still holding onto him tightly, her small arms wrapped around his waist. The cold had settled into their bones, but there was something else, something deeper. It was the feeling of survival, of having escaped, at least for now. But they weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. The van was still out there, and whoever was after Mia wasn't going to stop until they had her. Reaper's thoughts raced as he navigated the narrow, winding trail that led deeper into the forest. His mind flickered back to the moment when he first heard Mia's desperate whisper, "Please save us." It had been a simple plea, but it had changed everything for him. For the first time in years, he had something to fight for. His whole life had been about riding alone, about surviving by his own rules. But now, with Mia, it was different. He had to protect her, and he wasn't sure how to do that. The cabin was the only place he could think of. It wasn't much, but it was isolated. The perfect place to hide. The bike rumbled beneath him as they took a sharp turn, and Reaper could see the dim outline of the cabin through the trees. It looked the same as he remembered, old, weathered, but still standing strong against the storm. He didn't know how much longer they had before the men found them, but he wasn't going to waste time. They had to get inside, lock the doors, and prepare for whatever was coming. Reaper pulled up to the cabin, the gravel crunching under the tires. He turned off the engine and looked at Mia, her face pale from the cold, her eyes wide with fear. She was trying to be brave, but he could see the anxiety creeping into her expression. She was just a kid, and this wasn't the world she should be living in. He hated that it was his world that had dragged her into it. He helped Mia off the bike and led her toward the front door of the cabin. The old wooden steps creaked under their weight as they climbed up, and Reaper glanced over his shoulder, his senses alert. He didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no engines in the distance, but he couldn't relax. Not yet. He pushed the door open and ushered Mia inside. The air inside was stale, the smell of dust and old wood filling his nostrils. The cabin wasn't much, just a small room with a few chairs, a bed in the corner, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. It was better than nothing. It would have to do. Reaper quickly shut the door behind them and bolted it, locking it tight. He didn't know if the men would find them here, but he wasn't taking any chances. He turned to Mia, who had already curled up on the couch, wrapping herself in the blanket he had given her earlier. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and it broke his heart. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Mia nodded, but her face betrayed her fear. "I'm scared," she said quietly, her voice trembling. Reaper sat down across from her, his eyes softening. "I know," he said, "but you're safe here. They won't get to you." Mia didn't say anything else, but Reaper could see that she was trying to believe him. She wanted to, but the doubt in her eyes told him that it wasn't that simple. Reaper ran a hand through his wet hair and stood up. He had to think. He needed a plan. The men were still out there, and he had no idea how long they had before they came looking for them again. He went to the small window and peered out into the storm. The rain was coming down harder now, the wind whipping the trees outside. It was dark, and there was no sign of anyone following them, but that didn't mean they were in the clear. He had to make sure they were safe. "Stay here," he said, turning back to Mia. "I'm going to check the perimeter. Make sure no one's around." Mia nodded, her eyes wide with worry, but she didn't say anything. Reaper grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, the rain hitting him like 1,000 needles. The cold bit at his skin, but he didn't care. He moved quickly, checking the trees and the ground for any signs of movement. His eyes were sharp, his senses heightened as he searched the area. He didn't trust anyone right now, and that included the people who had been after Mia. He walked around the cabin, his boots crunching in the mud, until he reached the back. The storm had made everything harder to see, but Reaper didn't need to see clearly to know something was off. There was a broken branch, a footprint in the mud, and something else, something that made his heart skip a beat. The van. It was parked just off the trail, hidden in the shadows of the trees. Reaper's blood ran cold as he stepped back, his mind racing. They had found them. He turned quickly, rushing back to the cabin. The men were close. Too close. Reaper burst through the door, his voice low but urgent. "Mia, we have to go?" "Now." Mia looked up at him, her face filled with confusion and fear. "What's happening?" she asked. "They found us," Reaper said, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to leave, and we need to leave now." Mia scrambled off the couch, her eyes wide with panic. Reaper grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the back door. He didn't know where they would go next, but they couldn't stay here. Not with the van waiting just outside. They had to keep moving. They had to survive. Reaper's heart pounded in his chest as he led Mia through the back door and into the storm. They were running again. But this time, he wasn't just running for himself. He was running for her. And he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Reaper's heart was pounding in his chest as he and Mia ran through the storm, the heavy rain blurring their vision. The cabin was behind them now, hidden in the woods, and the van was still out there, following them, hunting them. Reaper didn't know where they were going, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. He kept pushing Mia forward, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with each step. The night was darker than it had ever been, the only light coming from the flashes of lightning in the distance. The wind howled through the trees, the sound of the storm almost deafening. Reaper barely noticed it. He was too focused on getting them out of this. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to find a place where they could hide. But where? The woods seemed endless, the path uncertain. He had to think fast. "Stay close, Mia," Reaper said, his voice harsh from the tension, but steady. Mia was stumbling slightly, trying to keep up with him as they moved through the forest. Her small figure was barely visible in the darkness, but Reaper could feel her presence, could hear her quiet breathing behind him. She was scared. He knew that, but he had to keep her moving. They couldn't stop now. The sound of footsteps grew louder behind them, and Reaper's blood ran cold. They were closer than he had thought. The men were getting better at tracking them, and Reaper couldn't afford to make a mistake. "We have to get to the road," Reaper muttered under his breath, his mind racing. The road. It was their only hope. If they could make it to the highway, they might be able to find help, or at least blend into the traffic. But they were still too deep in the woods, and the men were closing in fast. Reaper's mind raced as he tried to figure out their next move. He had to think. The footsteps were getting closer, and the men's voices were now faintly audible, carrying through the storm. They were talking, planning. Reaper didn't know how much longer they had. He couldn't let them catch up. Not now. Not when Mia was depending on him. "Keep up, Mia," Reaper said, urging her to move faster. He glanced over his shoulder for a split second, his eyes scanning the dark forest behind them. The van was still following them, but it was slower now, the men probably waiting for a better moment to strike. Reaper could hear their voices clearly now. "They're close," one of the men said. "We need to find them now." The urgency in the man's voice made Reaper's stomach tighten. He pushed Mia forward, moving faster, his eyes darting from side to side as he tried to find any signs of the road. It had to be close. It just had to be. Mia's breathing was quick and shallow, and Reaper could feel her fingers trembling against his back. He didn't turn around to check on her, didn't say anything. He couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The road was just ahead. He could feel it. His heart was racing, his adrenaline surging. The men were getting closer, and Reaper could hear the crunch of their footsteps in the wet leaves behind him. They were gaining on them. He had to act. Just as Reaper reached the edge of the trees, he spotted it, a faint glow in the distance. The road. It was there, but the men were too close. They were almost on top of them. "Mia," Reaper said, his voice low and urgent. "Run. Get to the road. Now." Mia didn't hesitate. She let go of his back and sprinted ahead, her small form darting through the trees toward the distant road. Reaper followed closely behind, but his focus was still on the men who were now running after them. The sound of their footsteps was deafening, their voices growing louder with each passing second. Reaper gritted his teeth and pushed forward. They were almost there, almost to safety. But just as Mia reached the edge of the road, one of the men lunged at her, grabbing her arm and pulling her back into the woods. Reaper saw it happen in an instant. He couldn't let them take her. He wasn't going to let them hurt her. With a roar, Reaper lunged at the man, knocking him off balance and slamming him into the ground. The man grunted as he hit the wet earth, and Reaper wasted no time. He pulled out the knife from his belt and held it at the man's throat. "Touch her again, and I'll end you," Reaper snarled. The man's eyes widened in fear, and for a moment, there was silence. Reaper could hear Mia's breathing in the distance, still running toward the road, but he couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. The other men were. Still out there, and they were closing in fast. The man on the ground knew he was defeated. "We don't want to hurt her," he said, his voice shaking. "Just let her go." Reaper's eyes burned with rage. "You've already hurt her," he spat. "You're not getting her." He pulled the knife away slowly and stood, keeping his eyes on the man. He had to get back to Mia. He had to make sure she was safe. As the man staggered to his feet, Reaper turned and ran toward the road, his eyes scanning the distance for any sign of Mia. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not after everything. Mia was standing at the edge of the road, her small frame trembling as she looked back at him. The van was still close, and the men were regrouping. Reaper's heart dropped. He couldn't fight all of them off. Not here. Not now. But he wasn't giving up. Not without a fight. Reaper's heart was hammering in his chest as he sprinted toward Mia, the sound of his footsteps almost drowned out by the pounding rain. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The van was still close, and the men were already regrouping, ready for the next move. The situation was slipping out of his control, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up. Mia was just ahead, standing at the edge of the road, looking back at him with fear in her eyes. The headlights of the van cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward them. He couldn't let them catch her. Not now. Not ever. With a burst of energy, Reaper ran faster, his legs burning, his focus locked on Mia. He could see her trembling, her small frame barely visible in the storm, but she was standing her ground. She wasn't running anymore. She was waiting. Reaper reached her just as the men in the van began to approach, their voices growing louder. "Get back in the car," one of them shouted. "Now." But Mia stood tall, despite the fear in her eyes. Reaper placed a hand on her shoulder, pulling her closer to him. "It's okay, Mia," he whispered. "Stay behind me." She nodded, her small hand clutching his jacket tightly, trusting him completely. For a moment, Reaper felt a flicker of hope, the kind of hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. But that hope was short-lived. The men in the van were getting closer, their footsteps now louder, and Reaper knew they had to act fast. The road was empty, the rain pouring down, and the headlights of the van gleamed like an ominous warning. Reaper's mind raced. He couldn't just stand there. He had to fight. He had to protect her. He could hear the men's voices growing closer, the tension in the air thick with the promise of violence. Reaper's fingers tightened around the knife in his hand. He wasn't going down without a fight. "Mia, stay low," he said, his voice firm and steady despite the storm raging around them. "Get behind me. Do not move until I say so." Mia didn't say anything, but she did exactly as he instructed, crouching down behind him as the men reached the edge of the road. Reaper turned to face them, his stance wide, his muscles tense, his gaze locked on the men. They stopped about 10 feet away, the headlights of the van casting an eerie glow on their faces. The man leading the group stepped forward, a smirk on his face as he looked Reaper up and down. "You really think you can protect her?" the man asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're just a washed-up biker. You can't protect her from us." Reaper didn't flinch. He stood tall, his eyes unwavering. "I've protected more than you'll ever know," he said coldly. "And I'll die before I let you touch her." The man's smile faltered for a split second, and that was all Reaper needed. He lunged forward, the knife flashing in the rain. But the man was faster, dodging to the side just in time, and Reaper missed. The man's men were already drawing weapons, their faces hard with determination. "I warned you," the man growled. "You're going to regret this." Reaper was ready for them. His instincts kicked in as he ducked low, avoiding a swing from one of the men, and then lashed out with the knife, catching the second man across the arm. The man howled in pain, stumbling back, but Reaper didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Mia was behind him, and that was all that mattered. The first man advanced again, swinging a pipe at Reaper's head. Reaper blocked it with his arm, the impact jarring his bones, but he didn't back down. He stepped into the man's space, using his shoulder to slam him into the van, the man's breath escaping in a grunt. Reaper grabbed the man's arm, twisting it until he heard a satisfying crack. The man dropped to the ground, cursing under his breath. Reaper turned, his eyes scanning the others, but they were already retreating. The remaining men, realizing they were outmatched, backed away slowly, their hands raised in surrender. "This isn't over," one of them spat, his voice full of rage. "You can't protect her forever." Reaper's eyes narrowed, but he didn't take the bait. "Get in the van," he commanded, his voice cold and steady. "And stay the hell away from us." The men hesitated for a moment, then turned and retreated, their footsteps fading into the distance. Reaper kept his eyes on them until they disappeared, the storm now the only sound in the night. He stood there for a moment, catching his breath, the adrenaline starting to wear off. His body ached from the fight, but he didn't care. He had kept his promise. Mia was safe. For now. He turned to her, his expression softening as he saw the fear in her eyes. "You okay?" he asked gently. Mia nodded, her face pale but determined. "I'm okay," she whispered. "Are they gone?" Reaper nodded. "Yeah, for now." He looked around, his mind already working on the next move. They couldn't stay here for long. The men would be back, and next time, they wouldn't hesitate. But for now, they had a moment of peace. Reaper put a hand on Mia's shoulder and guided her toward the road. "Come on," he said, his voice steady. "Let's get out of here." They didn't look back as they walked into the storm, the promise of safety still a distant hope. But Reaper was determined. He wouldn't let anything happen to her. Not now. Not ever. Reaper and Mia walked through the storm, the rain still pouring down in heavy sheets as they made their way down the quiet road. The tension of the past few hours hadn't quite faded, and Reaper could feel the weight of every step pressing down on him. The fear in Mia's eyes hadn't gone away, but she was holding on to him tighter now, trusting him even more. She wasn't just running for her life anymore. She was fighting to survive, and he would fight beside her until they were both safe. He glanced back one last time, making sure there were no signs of the men, no headlights approaching, no sound of engines. The road was eerily empty, and it seemed like they had escaped, at least for the moment. But Reaper knew better than to believe that it was over. The men would be back. They always came back. The sound of the rain mixed with the distant rumble of thunder, the world feeling far too quiet for comfort. Reaper kept his pace steady, knowing that every second counted, every step needed to be deliberate. He had to get Mia to a place where she could be safe. His cabin had always been his sanctuary, the one place where he had found peace, but it wasn't enough anymore. It was too close to the city, too close to where they might be found again. He needed to think of something further, something more remote. They had to go far away, somewhere the men wouldn't even think to look. "Mia," he said, his voice softer than usual, as they moved down the road. "I need you to stay close. If we stop, we stay hidden. No noise. Just stay quiet." Mia nodded, her small figure close behind him, her eyes wide but filled with determination. She had been through so much already, and even though Reaper had promised to protect her, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up. The night felt endless, and every road ahead seemed to blur in the storm. They finally reached an old gas station just off the road. The sign was barely visible, half of the lights flickering in the downpour, but it was the only thing resembling shelter for miles. Reaper stopped, looking around. It wasn't much, but it was out of sight. "Stay here," he said to Mia, his voice firm, though he was far from relaxed. He didn't want to leave her side, but he knew they couldn't stop without checking their surroundings first. He slipped into the small, dilapidated building, his boots making little sound as he moved through the rain-soaked interior. The smell of rust and oil lingered in the air, and the building had clearly been abandoned for a long time. There was no sign of life, but that didn't mean they were safe. Reaper moved carefully, checking the perimeter of the station, his hand on the gun at his side, just in case. Everything was quiet, too quiet. There were no signs of anyone having been there recently, but Reaper wasn't about to let his guard down. He had learned the hard way that the quietest moments often held the most danger. After making sure there were no immediate threats, Reaper returned to Mia, who was standing just outside the door, her eyes scanning the storm. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of concern. "But we can't stay long." Mia nodded again, her small face illuminated by the dim light. She didn't argue, didn't question him. She just trusted him, and that was all Reaper needed. They sat down together in the corner of the building, the noise of the rain battering the windows as Reaper kept an eye on the road. His mind was still racing, trying to figure out the next move. He couldn't stay here, couldn't let Mia stay in one place for too long. He needed to find somewhere safer, somewhere no one could trace them. He thought about the hideout in the mountains, the place where no one had found him in years. It was far, but it was the only place he could think of where they might be able to lay low. Reaper turned to Mia, who was staring at him, her small hands folded in her lap. "Mia," he began, his voice low, "I need you to promise me something." Mia looked up, her big eyes focused on him. "What?" "If anything happens," Reaper said, his throat tightening, "you keep running. You don't stop, you don't look back. You make it to the mountains, and you stay there until I get you. Do you understand?" Mia nodded, but Reaper could see the fear in her eyes. "I'll be okay," she whispered. Reaper swallowed hard, his heart heavy. He didn't want to think about the possibility of not being there, of not being able to protect her. But he had to prepare her. They both had to be ready. The night was still young, but Reaper knew that the worst was yet to come. The men were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until Mia was back in their hands. He would do anything to make sure that didn't happen. He had already made one promise to Mia's mother, and he wasn't about to break it. "We'll be fine," Reaper said, more to himself than to Mia. "But we have to keep moving." They sat in silence for a few more minutes, the sound of the storm filling the air. Reaper's mind was still racing, his thoughts spinning around the same idea: they had to leave. He couldn't afford to rest. They had to be ready. He stood up, motioning for Mia to follow. "Let's go," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "We've got a long road ahead." Mia stood up, and together, they stepped back out into the storm. Reaper didn't know what the next few hours would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, he wasn't going to let anyone take Mia. He would fight until his last breath to make sure she stayed safe. Reaper and Mia moved swiftly through the rain, the storm continuing to hammer down with no mercy. The world around them was a blur of wet pavement, the sky flashing with bursts of lightning as the wind whipped through the trees. Reaper's focus was unwavering, his eyes scanning the path ahead, constantly aware of the danger that still loomed behind them. Mia, still clinging to him, was quiet now, her small body trembling not just from the cold, but from the tension that seemed to hang in the air between them. Reaper had never been a father, but right now, he felt an overwhelming need to protect her, as if his very existence depended on it. The footsteps of the men were a distant echo, but that did nothing to ease the pressure building inside him. They had to keep moving, and they had to stay ahead. Every second counted. They reached a narrow dirt road that veered off the main highway. Reaper glanced down at Mia, who was looking up at him, her face full of trust despite everything. Her wide eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was scared, but she was relying on him. That thought drove him forward, even faster. The road was deserted, a long stretch of emptiness with only the occasional flash of headlights from passing vehicles. In the distance, they had to get farther, get away from everything familiar, because Reaper knew that as long as they stayed close to the city, the men would always find them. The mountains, that's where they needed to go. The place that would hide them, keep them safe. But even as he thought about it, Reaper knew it wouldn't be easy. The journey ahead was treacherous, and they couldn't afford to make a wrong turn. Mia wasn't used to this. She was just a child, thrown into a nightmare that wasn't her fault. He had seen a lot of bad things in his life, but this was different. Mia deserved more than this. Reaper pushed that thought aside. He couldn't afford to feel sorry for her. He had to keep his head in the game. Mia needed him, and that was all that mattered. They walked for what felt like hours, the rain never letting up, the world around them a mix of water and shadow. Reaper had no idea how far they had gone, but the exhaustion was starting to settle in. He could feel it in his bones. Every muscle ached, every breath seemed harder to take, but he couldn't stop, not when Mia was depending on him. He glanced back at her, and to his surprise, she was still holding up. Her small feet were caked in mud, her clothes soaked through, but she was still walking beside him, her pace steady. It was more than Reaper had expected from her. She had a strength inside her, something that made her more than just a scared little girl. She was a survivor, just like him. "You doing okay?" Reaper asked, his voice quieter than usual. Mia nodded, her small hand gripping his arm tighter. "Yeah," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I'm okay." Reaper didn't say anything else. He didn't know what else to say. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar. Something like pride, but mixed with something else, something darker. He wasn't sure if it was the weight of responsibility or the overwhelming need to keep going, but he was proud of Mia. She was tougher than he had realized. As they pushed on, the sounds of the storm seemed to drown out the rest of the world. Reaper's mind kept returning to the van and the men who were still out there. He knew they wouldn't stop. But he had a plan, and it was a good one. The mountains were their best bet. It would take them farther from the city, deeper into the wilderness, where there were fewer roads, fewer people. Reaper could hide there. He had to. The journey would be hard, but it was their only chance. Mia was quiet again, her face hidden by her soaked hair, her body shivering from the cold. Reaper wanted to stop, to rest, but he couldn't afford it. Not yet. They couldn't afford to stop. As they walked, Reaper couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was just a gut feeling, something he couldn't explain, but it was there, gnawing at him. He scanned the surroundings, his hand never straying far from the gun at his side. The night was too still, too quiet. It felt wrong. Just as the thought crossed his mind, he heard a noise in the distance. A twig snapping. Reaper froze, his hand moving to his side, his fingers gripping the gun. He didn't know if it was a person or just an animal, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Mia, Reaper whispered urgently, stay close. Mia did as she was told, not questioning him, her small form huddling against him. Reaper's instincts kicked in as he moved forward, his eyes scanning the darkness. He wasn't sure where the sound had come from, but he was ready. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Another noise, this time closer. Reaper's senses sharpened, and he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't good. We need to move, he said, his voice low but firm. He turned quickly, grabbing Mia's hand and pulling her with him. He didn't know if they were being followed or if it was just his imagination, but he couldn't risk it. They had to get to safety, and fast. As they ran, Reaper's mind raced, thinking of all the worst-case scenarios. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a second. His focus remained on Mia, making sure she kept up with him, her small feet splashing in the puddles. He couldn't hear anything behind them now, and for a moment, the world seemed still. But Reaper knew better than to relax. They couldn't stop. Not yet. They had to keep moving, keep running, until they were safe. Mia was depending on him, and he would die before he let anyone take her. The storm had not let up, and neither had the fear that clung to Reaper's chest like a vice. Mia was still beside him, her small hand gripping his tightly, her breath quick and shallow as they pushed forward through the rain-soaked night. Every step was a reminder of how far they'd come, how much they had survived, but Reaper knew better than to relax. They were not safe yet. The men who had been chasing them were relentless. And while the night was growing quieter, the tension was still heavy in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Reaper glanced over at Mia, her face pale, her expression determined but weary. She was fighting to stay strong, to keep going. But he could see it in her eyes. She was exhausted. They both were. They had been running for hours now, through the rain, through the night, and Reaper wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up. But he couldn't stop. Not when she was counting on him. Mia, we're almost there, he said, his voice softer than usual, though it carried an edge of urgency. Just a little further. Mia nodded without saying anything, her small body still trembling from the cold, but she kept moving. Reaper could feel her trust in him, and it was that trust that kept him going. He had promised to protect her, and he wasn't going to break that promise. As they made their way down the muddy path, the sound of the rain started to die down, and the wind began to slow, as though the storm was finally starting to lose its strength. But the stillness made Reaper uneasy. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and the last thing he wanted was to let his guard down now. They were too close to safety, but there was no such thing as too careful when it came to the danger they were facing. Reaper spotted a small cabin up ahead, partially hidden by the trees. It wasn't much, but it was secluded, exactly what they needed right now. That's it, Reaper said, his voice low, pointing toward the cabin. We'll stop there. Mia's eyes flickered with hope as she looked at the cabin. She didn't say anything, but Reaper could see the relief wash over her, even if it was only temporary. They were close. He could feel it in his bones. As they approached the cabin, Reaper stayed alert, his eyes scanning the area, making sure no one was following them. He didn't hear anything, but that didn't mean much. The men could be out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Reaper wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to let Mia become a target again. He pushed open the door to the cabin, the old wood creaking under his weight as he stepped inside. The air was musty, the smell of old furniture and wood filling his lungs. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over their heads. Reaper moved quickly, checking the windows, the doors, making sure everything was secure. Mia followed him inside, her eyes wide as she took in their surroundings. The cabin was simple, with a small kitchen area and a worn-out couch by the fireplace. A single bed sat in the corner, and Reaper could tell it hadn't been used in years. But it didn't matter. It was shelter. It was safe, for now. Reaper walked over to the small table in the corner and set down his pack, his hands moving quickly as he checked the contents. There wasn't much, just some food, a few medical supplies, and his gun. He pulled out the gun, checking the clip before setting it down on the table. He had to stay ready. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Stay here, he said, turning to Mia. I'm going to check the perimeter. Don't open the door for anyone. Mia nodded, her eyes wide but trusting. "I won't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Reaper took a deep breath before heading back outside, the cool night air hitting his face as he stepped onto the porch. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. They were so close to safety, but they still weren't out of the woods yet. He couldn't let his guard down. He moved around the cabin, checking the windows, making sure there were no signs of anyone following them. The storm had finally started to clear, and the silence in the forest was almost unnerving. Reaper's eyes darted from tree to tree, his senses heightened, but there was nothing. No sign of movement. No sound of footsteps. For a moment, he thought they were in the clear. But then, he heard something. A low, distant rumble. The sound of an engine. Reaper's heart skipped a beat as he turned back toward the cabin. The men were close. Too close. He rushed back inside, his pulse racing. "Mia, get down," he hissed, grabbing her and pulling her to the ground behind the table. The engine sound grew louder, closer, and Reaper's mind raced as he thought of their next move. The men had found them. They had been too slow, too careless. Now, it was time to fight. Reaper reached for his gun, his fingers gripping it tightly as he prepared for whatever was coming. He had made a promise to Mia's mother, and he was going to keep it. He wasn't going to let anyone take her. Not while he was still breathing. The engine sound grew louder, and Reaper's mind clicked into survival mode. He couldn't let this be the end. He had to get Mia out of here. He had to keep her safe. As the sound of the van reached its peak, Reaper's hand tightened around the gun, ready for whatever was about to happen.